Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. Today I have one heck of a terrifying upload to share with you. Before we get into it though, a couple links. As you all know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon and PayPal are in the description below. Merch is displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support this channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It does not cost you a cent. Click that like button, takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads I put out daily, click that bell icon, and folks, please leave a comment. Why? Well, because all of these things they do definitely matter, and they definitely help this channel to continue to grow and go. With that, I have taken too much of your time. Let's get on with today's upload, shall we? Today's first encounter. My buddy and I were set in a clearing that abutted a large tract of woodland in northern Illinois. This is one of our favorite areas to bang out a couple of coyote every now and then. About 45 minutes before daylight would be gone, we heard the varmints howling in the woods to our north. My buddy had a call in hand and started working what is known as the dying rabbit. That sound of the dying rabbit is irresistible to the coyotes. It never fails to bring them in. My buddy was calling every 2 or 3 minutes with little time in the day, but we knew they were nearby. Our truck was parked about a quarter of a mile away from our position, and we were in full camo, sitting against a clump of trees and bramble about 40 yards into the field of grass, away from the main wood line. As my buddy continued to make this call, we started to see a couple of heads popping up from the grass. A total of 4 coyote began trotting toward what they suspected was a late afternoon snack, heading directly towards us. The 2 of us raised our beads into position for a takedown when the unexpected happened. The coyotes hit their brakes, raised their heads, and out of the woods to our east was this huge creature tearing out of the trees, heading right for them. The coyotes immediately started to hightail it to our west, running through the field and heading for cover of the trees. We could immediately tell that at least one of them wouldn't stand a chance of escaping. This creature ran across the field in forward lean, and it had to have been covering the ground 3 times faster than those coyotes were. Just before the coyotes could make it to the woodline, the monster dove toward them. We heard a loud, cat-like squeal followed by silence. We sat in our position, stunned by the spectacle that had just unfolded before our eyes. This creature arose to its feet with a coyote in its hand. We could see it manipulating the dead creature while it stood in the field. This coyote, by the way, was at least 60 to 70 pounds, but in the hands of this creature, it looked like it was a rabbit. That's how big this monster's hands and arms were. We ducked down low as this creature turned to slowly walk back across the field in the direction it had come from, eventually disappearing into the timber. As you can imagine, this was an unbelievable sighting in any man's book. In hindsight, one of the most frightening aspects was that we had been sitting there making calls for about 3 hours before anything had happened. We were now left wondering if we had been actually calling this creature in, who happened to be closing in on our position when the coyotes showed up. I guess we should thank God for sending those coyotes, because this monster had come out of the trees only maybe 80 yards from where we were sitting, and it could have been on top of us before we would react. This gigantic monster appeared to be moving as fast as a speeding 4x4 across the field. There was no way to really judge how fast other than estimating 40 miles per hour. The coyotes were at a complete disadvantage in the tall grass and bramble, not to mention the fallen trees and patches of brush throughout the field that they had to navigate as they ran. The monster, on the other hand, just took a straight line sprint, clearing everything in its path at a high speed. It was absolutely incredible to watch. After the kill was made, the creature had left. The two of us did not venture out into the field where the incident had occurred. We were quite happy to get out of there with our shirts still on our backs. The creature was everything that we had seen and heard about. It had been every bit of 8 foot, maybe even more, and looked like a refrigerator on legs when it was running across that field. When it had committed to the dive for its prey, it launched itself like a ball player stealing second. We heard a brief yelp or screeching sound as that coyote met its demise, and then it was all over. After we made it back to the truck, the two of us were talking about the dive for the kill and thought that it actually made a lot of sense. We thought about the alternative options available to such a huge creature trying to reach down in an effort to grab a small evasive animal. To us, it would be like you or I trying to catch a mouse with our hand while running around the house. It'd be virtually impossible. I think the same thing is true for them when hunting smaller game. They simply commit themselves to a fly and dive, landing on the prey and dispatching it quickly. If this thing had put a body slam on anything, it wouldn't be getting up anytime soon. This creature had to have weighed 400 to 500 pounds, and when it went airborne, it was fully extended. It had to have been some 12 feet in the air. It looked like this gigantic German shepherd flying through the air. As it walked away with the coyote in its clutches, it held it like someone would hold a bunch of bananas, and this was a 60 to 70 pound creature. It never turned and looked in our direction, so we were unknown by it at the time, or so we thought. Its fur, or should I say hair, was long, shaggy looking. It was more of a grayish color than anything else, but it was a healthy gray and black mixed. At the distance we watched it from, the arms on this thing looked like sections of trees hanging from its shoulders with ginormous claws. If it was to get its hands on you or I, there would be no chance of escaping this grip. Today's second encounter. In 1967, my dad and 3 other men in the neighborhood took me and 4 other boys on a trip out into Ontario to fish for muskies. We found ourselves landing in Perlette Falls Airport, where we met up with a couple of float planes that ferried us to a place near Ear Falls. My only memory was that we had rented a pretty big cabin for the week with plenty of room for all of us to rough it in. Heck, we didn't care at the time if we slept in the woods. We were up in the sticks, landing on water in a seaplane, and we were going muskie fishing. My dad's hired a guide whose name was Lars, I believe, and we had 3 boats for the group. The boats were pretty big, something like 18 to 20 feet, and they had plenty of power to get us all around in a hurry. Several days into the trip, we had been into fishing hot and heavy every day, just as advertised. We were landing muskies in the range of 28 to 36 inches on a regular basis and having a ball. The fight of these fish pound for pound is outrageous. If you've never caught them, most of the shoreline that we were fishing had forest coming right down to the water's edge. Periodically, there was an area of bank with no trees that was visible along the shore. We had been fishing every day facing the shore, and pretty close to it for the most part. It must have been 4 p.m. when we heard this loud bang and long roar coming from the woods. We all looked at each other and asked the guide, what was that? He said it sounded like a large grizzly bear. It was only 2 minutes after we heard the first roar and another one sounded coming from the opposite direction of the woods. There must have been either 2 of them or 1 very fast runner. Over the next 15 minutes or so, as we sat fishing the bank, we heard several more roars. It seemed like they were being made back and forth by two different bear. At least that's what we had thought at the time. Now, before I continue, I've got to set up a visual for what was about to happen. We were sitting in 3 boats, spaced maybe 150 feet apart. All of these boats were about 100 feet from shore, facing one of these slopes on the bank that I just told you about. The water we were fishing was approximately 6 feet deep, and the bottom was covered with this grass that these muskies hung around in. We were all looking at each other from boat to boat as we listened to these roars, which sounded like they were getting closer and closer to our position. I don't know why, but I felt like a fuse had been lit and a bomb was going to explode. Explode it did. Suddenly, the woods directly in front of us erupted in what I can only describe as a lion fight. The volume and intensity of the roars was so loud that it hurt my ears. I couldn't see what was making the noises yet. I looked at the other boats to my right, and the guide was waving to start the motors. As we started the engines and we were all motoring further away from the shore, everyone was still looking at the tree. The roars almost drowned out the sounds of the engine. We switched into neutral, and all of the boats were at least 300 feet from the shore, facing the woods. It was so intense, I was trembling. I could now make out 2 large, dark figures engaging in apparent battle for supremacy just inside of the tree line. The growling and roaring was unrelenting as the struggle ensued within the trees. At one point, I almost felt like I was going to faint. I really can't find the words to describe my emotions. Right at a time when I thought that things could possibly not get any worse, these 2 gigantic black creatures came tumbling out of the trees, rolling down the embankment, slashing and biting each other. Both of the creatures were now in the water, and every time one would start to stand, the other would slash at it. They would grapple, smashing each other into the water. Each time one bit the other, the screams of pain were even louder than when they had been apart. I remember thinking that I wanted to stop watching and listening, but I couldn't. I could tell that one of the creatures was starting to get the better of the other, and finally, with one titanic blow, the creature's body buckled to the ground, and it lay there unmoving. The winner stood leering over the other, growling ever more intensely. And then it looked up to the sky and kind of howled. I thought the downed creature was dead. It lay half in the water, half out, face down and not moving. Then the other creature turned to face us, raising its head in the air, letting out what sounded like a half roar, half scream. It then turned to the victim and stood over it, growling over and over again. A few moments later, it walked up the embankment, roaring and screaming into the woods. Everyone in the boat was shell-shocked, and our mouths were agape. Some of the guys were holding their heads like they were losing their minds, and none of us could speak. I saw the creature that was lying in the water lift its arms and drop them like it was its last gasp. We motored away and headed back to the lodge for the evening. Now, I won't get into all the conversation and whatnot that went on that night because there is so much more to tell you about these creatures. I had never heard a grizzly bear in my life, but when the guide said the roars had sounded like big grizzlies, something had said to me that that was not true. These things were far more canine than bear-like. Up until that point in my life, I had never heard anything living make a sound that loud. The sounds were as intense as a diesel train whistle. It had been closer. It may have broken our eardrums, and when they were fighting in front of us, some of the other guys had actually had their hands to their ears. The oars that were lying on the aluminum boat seats were vibrating loudly. Another thing was the fight itself. At no time during the fight did they hit each other with a closed fist. They were slashing each other with these huge claws, grappling and biting. It seemed to me that the biting was used to get an advantage during what appeared to be a wrestling match of mammoth proportions. The fight had been so intense that I couldn't understand how either of them could withstand another second before one of them had dropped. The guide went back to the scene the next day and the one in the water was gone, so maybe it had survived, but we'll never know. When they were slashing and thrashing each other around in the water, the waves which was created was rocking our boats that far off of shore. They were incredibly large, and when their mouths were open and roaring, in particular the one that in the end was looking at us while roaring, I could see these huge white canines, and it looked like a bowling ball could fit in its mouth with no problem. The two of them had to have been at least 8 feet tall, and at least 500 to 600 pounds, maybe more. When they were smashing each other against the ground, I could feel the reverberations out on the water, and you could hear it when they were slashed or hit. This had to be some type of animalistic fight for territory or domination. It was like they were calling each other to a duel and neither was going to back down. In my opinion, these are vicious and bloodthirsty wild beasts that are not to be trifled with. But there are people walking around in the woods with no firearms who must be out of their minds thinking they are going to visit Mr. Happy of Forests. One of these monsters could easily take down a fully grown man and just launch him into orbit. This type of physical strength and force is something that we will know nothing about and quite possibly never will. Today's third encounter. My wife and I are both born and bred in New Jersey, having lived here our entire lives. Having been married for over 25 years, we had purchased a new home and moved to an area close to the New Jersey Pinelands National Reserve, which is a protected area within the state. There are quite a few homes in our community, and it would be considered by most to be somewhat upscale. I don't make mention of my town because I would rather not bring any ill will against our community or our residents for what had occurred. Looking back, I believe the actual experiences had begun years earlier. The houses in my neighborhood each have a fairly large piece of property. Now, I'm not talking about farm, but let's just say an acre or better for the most part. I can remember seeing that someone had posted on a telephone pole a picture and a name of their missing dog in what I believe was 2008. It was a small pedigree, I think a Shih Tzu. Now, there's nothing particularly unusual about that in any community. Dogs do get lost and run away, and we are all aware of that. I don't think it was but a few months later that someone else had posted the same kind of notice on the poles in our area about their dog becoming missing. This dog was also a smaller pedigree, I believe some type of Cocker Spaniel. Our neighborhood was definitely upscale, so as the list of missing dogs grew, there are typically those that were smaller in size. By the way, the grooming trucks are regular visitors to the homes in that area. I only say that to paint a vivid picture for you of the number and types of dogs of which I speak. Over a period of about 2 years, the amount of missing dogs had gotten to the point where the local news would actually say during their broadcast that another dog had come up missing in such and such community. It was now a common line of thinking that the dog thieves were working in our township. But in spite of everyone's diligence to walk their dog on a leash and try not to leave them alone outside, we all knew that it was not always possible during our busy lives, especially during inclement weather, to walk your dog. Sometimes we were left with an old clothesline tied to a tree in the backyard. In spite of all of this apparent dog thievery going on, my wife and I actually had our own heart set on getting a dog, and we did. We purchased a Belgian Shepherd dog from a breeder in Connecticut. We had set a line for him in the backyard which consisted of a large auger-type screw that was turned down into the ground some 3 feet, to which was attached about a 25-foot of welded chain link. Our dog, who we named Lucky, wore a stainless steel choke collar, and we would hook him to the chain with a brass snap. Believe me when I tell you there is no way that Lucky could break away from this tether without his head coming off first. I would only put Lucky on this tether when it was virtually impossible due to weather or time to walk him. Now, because of our proximity to the reserve, there was more than ample supply of wildlife around our home. I'm talking about deer, raccoon, woodchuck, rabbit, squirrel, chipmunks, damn near anything else that could be thought of, and all of them would cause Lucky to get into an uproar. He would bark and howl and even stand on his hind legs when yapping at these critters. Over time, he learned that he had a choker around his neck that was attached to a limited length of chain. Over the next months, I have to say that you kind of get immune to dogs barking. There was so many animals around, and the deer would actually taunt him, now knowing he could not chase them. They would stay 100 feet away in the woods, eating and walking around, which drove old Lucky crazy. In April, we had been getting rain for some 3 days or so. We all know the feeling of when it's going to end when these rains come, so I would keep the snap end of the chain by the back door, which enabled me to just open the door, hook him to his tether, and allow him to take care of his business for 15 minutes in the rain, after which he would always scratch at the back door to let you know that he was done. He started out with his usual ritual barking, after which he began sniffing around and then relieve himself. I have to admit that on that night, I kind of lost track of time, being involved in something on the computer upstairs in my home. When I looked at the clock, a half an hour had gone by in the pouring rain. I shouted down the stairs to my wife to see if she had let the dog in, and she said, "No, I thought he was upstairs with you." So I went down and opened the door, and his chain was lying in the grass, and he was gone. As you well would expect, I was outside calling for him over and over again. As the rain was coming down in buckets, my wife was now by the back door after realizing what had happened. At some point, I looked down and saw the snap was detached from the chain and gone. Now, this was a solid brass swivel ring attached to a clasp, which I am sure that you yourself have seen before. There is no way that you or I could break it or tear it away from the welded chain. Why you would have a better chance of backing a galvanized screw out of the ground. I immediately thought of the supposed stolen dogs in the area, but in my mind, I had said all the thief would have to do was unsnap him from his collar. This chain had been broken off, which could more than likely only be done by bolt cutters. As I was standing there in the rain, I looked down on the ground. Even though our backyard was grass, there was quite a bit of well-worn area right down to soil where Lucky had been running around throughout the many months on his tether. As I stood there looking, I saw 2 huge footprints in soaked soil. They looked like huge giant wolf prints. The rain was coming down so hard that they were actually deteriorating before my eyes. Lucky was very obedient, and no matter what, he would come to my call, especially when he was out in shoddy conditions. I called the police, and when they arrived at our home, I told them what had happened and what I had seen in regards to the massive footprints. I was told by the police officer the usual rubbish about a black bear taking my dog. I said to him something sarcastically like, "Yeah, a black bear with huge wolf-like feet." We never saw Lucky again, and still to this day cats and dogs go missing in that area. Wow, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, my good friend Paul Pedersen Jr., who is been studying the Pine Barrens and the Jersey Devil for years. I do believe this area is within the pines. And, he had sent me some crazy photos before of Dogman footprints, right next to this woman's boot, like an Ugg boot. And these things were just absolutely enormous. Paul himself had actually never heard of Dogman. And I reached out to him one evening, told him who I was and about Dogman, and he watched the channel and then became obsessed. There are definitely these creatures in New Jersey, in the pines. All right, folks, I hope you all enjoyed today's upload as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. Guys, I'd like to thank you all for all of your support. Your support is truly what makes this channel so special and what continues to make it grow and go. With that being said, please, everyone, stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant. Keeping an eye on your children, the most precious commodity this world has, truly. Our pets, our family and friends. When I say pets, I mean, yes, they are our family and friends, but if you start noticing pets, small animals, and things like that disappearing, that means you know something is in your neck of the woods. Hopefully it never happens, but with that being said, God bless you all and have a blessed rest of your day.